Relatively obscure by media standards, Old Mombi was the antagonist of The Marvelous Land of Oz, L. Frank Baum's original sequel to The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. Introduced as an archetypal village witch, Mombi was later retconned as the dethroned Wicked Witch of the North. Today she is best remembered for her appearance in Disney's Return to Oz, but like the actresses who played the multi-faced spellbinder, Mombi is truly legion. Unlike her wicked predecessors from the previous novel, Mombi was introduced in humble surroundings. She wasn't an overlord, she controlled no armies, she wasn't the slave driver of Munchkins or Winkies. Mombi maintained a small house, a barn, and a pumpkin patch. She couldn't even call herself a witch legally because the Good Witch of the North, who ruled Mombi's homeland of Gillikin Country, outlawed the practice of magic. She shared her home with a young ward named Tip, a mysterious boy she was often cruel to, despite his faithful service. In my initial read-through, Mombi seemed like a bored, disenfranchised widow who dabbled in magic for fun and self-empowerment. I didn't feel that she fell from the graces of a high office. She didn't strike me as an Ursula, banished from any palaces. We learned of her especial fondness for the four-horned cow Tip would milk, and her frequent trips out of town for groceries, which usually meant she was trading secrets with other sorcerers. I thought Mombi was a person hungry for glamour. In this sense, she was like an inverted Dorothy. By the end of the novel, we learn that Tip was actually the heir of Oz's former king, Pastoria, who was dethroned by the wizard. What's more, Tip was born a baby girl. Dubbed Ozma, the rightful princess, had been magicked into a baby boy by Mombi in order to secure the wizard's reign. Interrogated by Glinda, the Good Witch of the South, Mombi claimed the wizard taught me all the magic tricks he knew. Some were good tricks, and some were merely frauds, but I have remained faithful to my promise. Glinda forced Mombi to reverse the spell concealing Ozma. Afterwards, she was given a potion which caused her to forget all of the spells she'd ever learned. The redemption of Mombi is one of the themes of Baum's Oz books, where few villains are ever killed outright, the Wicked Witches of the East and West being accidental exceptions. Mombi, according to the final pages of Marvelous Land, was supported by Ozma in her dotage, but later books would retcon her final fate as well as her backstory. In Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, the fourth book of the series, Mombi was referenced as the former Wicked Witch of the North, part of a quartet of malefactors who overthrew Ozma's father, King Pastoria, dividing Oz and ruling its 4 countries independently. She was later deposed by the Good Witch of the North, reduced to a life of squalor in rural Gillikin Country, where she secretly raised the old king's daughter as a boy slave out of spite. The reshaping of Mombi's backstory was presumably an attempt to cast the wizard in a more favorable light. Previously, he had been the Great Humbug, the interloper who destroyed Oz's rightful king and kidnapped a baby. Mombi herself was not featured in Dorothy and the Wizard, but a later book by Baum's successor, Ruth Plumley Thompson, featured her execution by water for previous offenses at the hands of Ozma. Understandably, this account has been criticized by the Oz community for many years because of its senselessness and for flying in the face of the established themes of the series. Subsequent books by modern authors retooled Mombi's death, offering a clone who was killed by Ozma so her newly recovered father wouldn't think she was weak. Baum never intended to write a sequel to Wonderful Wizard, and he certainly tried to end the series many times after Marvelous Land. In my mind, Oz is more coherent as a trilogy, but demand for further books plagued the author until the end of his life. Nevertheless, 14 Oz books were written by L. Frank Baum, and countless incarnations of his characters appeared in other media. The most memorable version of Mombi to appear off-page was played by Jean Marsh, Sophie Ward, and Fiona Victory in 1985's Return to Oz. The character is famously a hybrid of Mombi and Princess Langwidere from Baum's third Oz novel, Ozma of Oz. Langwidere in the novel possessed a vast collection of severed heads she could swap out to suit her mood. Like most of the weird and unsettling elements in Baum's Oz books, This was a thoughtful choice on the part of the author, and not a case of weird and unsettling for the sake of being weird and unsettling. It wasn't for shock value or a way for Baum to show us how ruthless and powerful Langwidere was. It was a commentary on narcissism, as the narcissist is the chameleon of human personality disorders. Like Mombi in the previous book, Langwidere didn't want to rule the world. She didn't even want to rule a kingdom. She wanted nothing more than to be left alone with her thoughts, playing her mandolin and admiring her own reflection. For these reasons, she was all too happy to relinquish her power at the end of the novel. I think Langwidere was conflated with Mombi in Return to Oz because Mombi could in fact shapeshift in Marvelous Land, a talent she employed to flee from Glinda near the end of the book. No longer a peasant hedge witch, Mombi in Return to Oz was now a glamorous princess in league with the demonic Gnome King. She retained her role as Ozma's jailer, but the guise of Tip was not used here. With Return to Oz being a spiritual sequel to MGM's 1939 musical, Mombi was echoed throughout the film by the wicked Nurse Wilson, encountered twice by Dorothy. For failing to contain Dorothy, she was imprisoned by the Gnome King, and later paraded through the Emerald City. I love her nebulous appearance at the end of the movie. It seems like a commentary on the shifting dreamscapes of the imagination, and fairy tales in general. Of course, this wasn't the first time Mombi appeared on screen. Baum himself featured a version of Mombi fused with the Wicked Witch of the West in his silent film, His Majesty the Scarecrow, in 1914. She maintained the essential traits of both characters, running a hedge operation out of her small house, though it was the Wicked Witch of the West she resembled physically, down to the eye patch, costume, braids, and umbrella. She even enslaved Dorothy once the girl arrived in Oz. Despite her obscurity, Mombi has made several appearances since the early 20th century on screen. Even Agnes Moorehead, who played Endora on Bewitched, played Mombi on an episode of Shirley Temple's Storybook after previously voicing the character on a radio drama. And in 1974, Ethel Merman voiced an animated Mombi in Journey Back to Oz, employing green elephants in her bid for power against the Scarecrow. These takes on Mombi and Oz are interesting, but there's very little thematic value to most of the movies she's appeared in. They tend to lean heavily into a good versus evil narrative. This is a common plight among fairy stories featuring wicked witches or selfish queens once they're adapted for the screen. There's never any nuance, no commentary on laziness or the way we treat our elderly, and the weird factor is always overplayed for comedic value. But that's my opinion. Speaking of opinions, it's time to mention my vote for the best iteration of Mombi on screen since Return to Oz. Fiona Shaw played the character in 2016's Emerald City. While the series was considered a failure in many ways by the Oz community, by critics, and myself for a lot of the reasons I mentioned already, Fiona Shaw channeled all of the subtlety and all of the indignation I felt for Mombi reading the original book. Bear in mind, she didn't ape the source material, but reinvented the character in a modern light. In Emerald City, Mombi cared for Tip, and she felt conflicted by her decision to guard the boy under lock and key. It's a pity we only met Fiona Shaw's Mombi once before the show was cancelled. To return to Baum's Mombi, she did have one redeeming trait, her sense of loyalty. Partway through the marvelous land of Oz, we meet General Ginger, leader of the all-female army of revolt. Ginger and company, having decided Oz has been ruled long enough by men, briefly conquered the Emerald City. At a certain point, Ginger retained the services of Mombi, who was hoping to recapture Tip. Tip, having escaped both Ginger and Mombi, is at this point enlisting the army of Glinda in the south, along with the Scarecrow, who wants to reclaim the Emerald City. Mombi shows no interest in political power during Ginger's occupation, and her obsession with Tip has nothing to do with motherly affection. She made a promise, years before the novel started, to keep Ozma away from the throne, to the Wizard, a character who isn't even in Oz any longer. How easy it would have been for Mombi to use Tip's true identity as a bargaining chip in order to crown herself Queen of Gillikin Country, or all of Oz. But the witch would sooner reduce her ward to a marble statue than break her promise to the Wizard, so long as she could keep an eye on the flighty child. This was Old Mombi, as Baum originally conceived of her, one of my favorite Oz characters, and probably one of my favorite witches in any fantasy, fairy tale, or literary novel. It's surprising Baum developed her as much as he did, considering the Wicked Witch of the West was so vague by comparison. It's as if he learned from his mistakes in the previous novel and truly reinvented the Wicked Witch for Marvelous Land. And it isn't that I'm opposed to witch characters striving for political power. I think the village witch archetype in general is ripe for this kind of storytelling. Ursula, who I've already mentioned in the Disney version of The Little Mermaid, probably owes a debt to the more ambitious, retconned version of Mombi Baum utilized in Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. But I can also see echoes of the original, less ambitious Mombi in Mirri Maz Duur from A Game of Thrones, who chose revenge and ultimately her own destruction over the freedom and power Daenerys offered. It's cleaner storytelling from my perspective, less convoluted and more effective. Regardless of my opinions, Mombi exists within the imagination in a variety of guises, just like all of the really successful witches of fiction. In writing this, I'm starting to wonder if I prefer Mombi to the Wicked Witch of the West, who in a previous video I named as my favorite femme fatale. I think Baum felt the same way, and I can understand why he later merged the two characters in 1914. As early as 1910, he called the previously unnamed Wicked Witch of the West Mamba, just one letter off from Mombi, who first appeared in 1904. Merging them was clever, and I'm surprised the trend hasn't caught on with revisionist storytellers, who tend to merge Mombi with other characters and roles from the franchise. For instance, in Lisa Feidler and Gabriel Gale's Ages of Oz young adult novels, Mombi is the superhuman Krumbrick Witch, a shape-shifting entity commanding the Wicked Witches of Oz, the mastermind behind the overthrow of King Pastoria. In Gregory Maguire's The Wicked Years novels, she is still Tip's keeper, but she also inherits the office of Nessa Rose Throp, the Wicked Witch of the East, who was basically the governess of Munchkinland. In the final book, Out of Oz, Tip relates an interesting story, which I'm paraphrasing slightly. Mombi dragged me on a long journey over the sands to one of the duchy principalities. I think it was Ev. When we arrived, Mombi presented herself before a second-rate duchess. The duchess knew a secret for changing the shape of her head and her body, and performed it for us as a kind of afternoon entertainment. There was only one screen at the end of the room, and she showed us that there were no trapdoors or hidden chambers in which a bevy of beautiful women could wait their turn to pretend to be the duchess. Her magic was limited to that one party trick, but she did enjoy demonstrating it. Later on the train, Mombi went off to use the powder room. I didn't recognize her when she got back. Later, I wondered if the Duchess of Ev woke up on her fainting couch the morning after we said goodbye to find herself dead. But Mombi has never looked back, and she presents herself effectively. So Maguire not only managed to retain Mombi's original character, that of a derelict village witch, he also injected the Languidir mythos from Return to Oz, which I thought was clever. And more than clever, I think it's a fair middle ground, preserving Mombi's origins, but also paying tribute to her legacy. If the ongoing efforts of writers, actresses, and artists are any indication, Mombi will be with us as long as Dorothy, Glinda, and the rest of Oz. Whether we see her as Old Mombi, the village witch, the princess, the mastermind, or the shapeshifter. Long live Mombi.
If you're gonna be a witch, be a witch.
Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed our time with Mombi today, don't forget to like and comment. I upload videos on storytelling, creativity, and how they intersect with spirituality. The modern mythologies that have shaped me as a writer and an occultist also feature heavily on this channel. So if you resonate with all of this, you might want to subscribe. If you love what I do, check out patreon.com/faypage. $2 a month gets you access to my Patreon blog and early access to new videos. Between videos, I usually work on patron postcards. New patrons at the $10 level get one as a thank you gift, and higher levels get one every month, as well as free tarot readings. Follow me on Instagram at FayPageAuthor. And a special thanks to my first patron, Sammy K.